The bell tolls at midnight. Greetings. I'd like to welcome all of my midnight marauders. Come on in, get comfy, and lend me your imagination. Is it really wise for one to assume that someone is weak due to their unbothered, calm demeanor? Or should we proceed with caution around those whom we deemed easy targets, a bully's playground? I call this slow leak into the unknown the Backwoods witch. Off in the distance, deep in the backwoods, near a heavy running creek with driftwood and a deer carcass stuck deep in the mud at the end of the clearing, there stood a dilapidated, old and dark wooden shack hidden behind the trees. In front of the shack sat a century-old redwood tree stump beside a barnyard. Carved into the tree stump was what appeared to be a small paragraph of words, too illegible to understand, and a list of names below it. Surrounding the paragraph and words were childlike drawings of wild, human-like dancing figures. One figure, its hair wild and expression monstrous, pointed toward the cracked barn doors. Inside the barn, Bedulah lay awake on a makeshift bed made up of mostly hay and a pile of old clothes donated to Bedulah from friends of her father's prayer group. Beside her was an old kerosene lamp that her mother Gloria gave her before she passed away. Draped over her was one large blanket that hardly kept her warm. The kerosene lamp didn't help much either, as the flame just seemed to dance but never produced any heat. She shivered from the freezing night air. Each breath she took produced condensation that seemed to turn into smoke and swirl around the barn, as if it were a spirit escaping into the air and searching for an exit before finding one through the barn doors. A breeze entered the barn and blew over Bedulah. A sudden calm came over her. "I know, Mama, I know," Bedulah whispered before dozing off to sleep. Bedulah awoke to a loud thud on the barn door and could hear a voice outside say in a thick southern accent, "Time to get up, girl." She recognized that it was her father, Reverend Bartholomew McCarthy. She was still shivering from the blistering cold of a January winter's unforgiving chill. The weather had to be no higher than 25 degrees, and Bedulah could see her breath as she shouted, "Okay, Pa." Bedulah sat up, her face grimacing in pain from a stiff back. Her hair was mangled in her face and her eyes struggled to focus, but she soon gathered her senses just enough to drag herself up and over to a wooden chair sitting in front of a vanity desk with an old wash bowl resting on it. Bedulah was usually homely and unkempt, but that day she decided to do her best to groom herself and present a clean and tidy appearance. Bedulah grabbed a face towel that hung on the back of the wooden chair. She went to place the face towel in the wash bowl, but realized that the water had frozen overnight. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open and her stepmother, Gretchen, peeked her head in and said, "Mornin', Bedulah." A look of surprise came across Bedulah's face as she uttered, "Gretchen, what are you doing here?" "Your father told me that you didn't want me to come see you, but I had to come check on you before your first day of high school and see if you needed anything," Gretchen responded. "Nah, I'm just fine, Gretchen," Bedulah coldly retorted. Gretchen's eyes examined the barn, and although feelings of disgust overtook her, she couldn't help but feel just as much pity for Bedulah's living conditions. "Bedulah, you don't have to keep living like this," Gretchen pleaded. "You can come live with me and your pa in the city. You can have your own room so you don't have to sleep in the barn. I know it's what Gloria would want for you." Hearing that name hit a nerve, and Bedulah stared daggers at Gretchen. "What my mother would want is for me to keep the house that she died in," Bedulah said. "And what I would want right now is to be left alone." Gretchen lowered her head. Sensing that Gretchen was about to wish her a good day, Bedulah curtly cut her off before she could get started, saying, "I gotta get going. I don't want to be late for my first day." Bedulah quickly grabbed her books off of the small table next to the washbowl, but accidentally knocked over the old kerosene lamp that her mother gave her before she passed away. It went crashing to the ground, shattering to pieces. "Damn it!" Bedulah yelled in frustration. "Oh, Bedulah, let me help you," Gretchen offered with sincerity. "No, it's fine. She wouldn't want your hands on it anyway. Please just leave me alone," Bedulah requested. Gretchen nodded her head and solemnly walked away. Bedulah watched Gretchen leave. Looking at the broken lamp, Bedulah's eyes filled with tears, knowing that was the only thing she had left to remind herself of her dear, sweet mother, Gloria. At night, Bedulah would light that kerosene lamp and gaze into the flame and feel comforted by its warm glow, feeling as if her mother was somehow illuminating from it. At times, she could almost hear her voice calling her name, and it healed a part of her that longed for her mother's loving guidance and peaceful reassurance. Bedulah quickly got dressed, grabbed her long black duster coat off the pile of clothes and put it on. She grabbed her backpack and hurried out of the barn, wiping her eyes while pushing the hair out of her face. Her nose was red and runny as she began the 4-mile walk to school, which seemed like an eternity, just to get out of the backwoods and onto the main road. She walked down the long embankment, smelling the rotting flesh of an old deer carcass, her mind racing with thoughts of anger that no young girl her age should have. She finally reached the main road and dark clouds began to form as if Bedulah had brought gloom to this clear, crisp day with just her presence. Suddenly, thunder began to roar and the crackle of lightning flashed across the sky, but it didn't faze Bedulah one bit. She continued down the road to the high school as if the sun were out and everything was as right as rain. Bedulah finally reached the school just as the first bell was ringing. Bedulah's first period class was already in session when she hurried inside, and all eyes were tightly on her. The teacher was a short, stocky man with a red, dusty-looking afro and freckles covering his entire face. He looked in shock to see Bedulah, who was almost 6 feet tall, brown-skinned and full-figured, standing at the classroom door, looking confused and uncomfortable. "Can I help you?" he asked. Bedulah was still looking around the room, and her classmates began to whisper in each other's ears while turning their nose up and giggling amongst themselves. The teacher, confused, walked over to Bedulah and said, "Excuse me, young lady, are you a student?" Bedulah's eyes focused on the teacher, and in her oddly soft voice said, "Yes, I am, sir. Bedulah McCarthy." "Is everything all right, young lady?" the teacher quickly asked. "I'm okay, sir," Bedulah replied, embarrassed as the other students looked on. She cracked a tiny, nervous smile, just enough to see small chips in her 2 front teeth. "I'm Mr. Gustafson, your homeroom teacher for this school year. Everyone, welcome Bedulah into our group today." The classroom fell silent except for one young man named Ellsworth Dooley, who boldly said, "Welcome, Bedulah." Her eyes darted towards the young man and then back to the teacher. "Bedulah, our closet room where we hang our sweaters and jackets, is right by that side door," Mr. Gustafson said. "Would you like to go and hang your jacket up to dry? There are also towels you can use to dry off a bit and then come back and join us. There is your assigned seat next to Desiree Proctor." As soon as the teacher mentioned the seating arrangement, Desiree frowned and immediately made one of the boys switch seats with her, stating that she needed to be by the window to be able to get fresh air. The rest of the class giggled and watched Bedulah closely as she looked frazzled and totally out of place, walking to the back closet to hang up her jacket and dry off her face and arms. Bedulah felt somewhat scared and embarrassed about how class started. Also, her clothing and appearance sure didn't help things. She looked in the mirror that was hanging on the wall in the closet, and all she could see was her mother's eyes staring back at her. Bedulah had beautiful, strong features, but as beautiful as she was, she looked disheveled as the dark circles under her eyes were very noticeable. She smoothed her long, light brown, thick, wavy hair back out of her face and behind her ears. A small bit of confidence came over her as she smiled at her reflection in the mirror, but she immediately closed her mouth as her chipped teeth were showing. Bedulah walked out of the closet and all eyes were on her as she was wearing a long brown dress that looked old and faded. Everyone, including the teacher, was silent for a few seconds. Bedulah realized that she must have looked like someone from another world. The girls had on beautiful dresses and new shoes. The boys were clean-cut and had on fresh attire. Bedulah's face showed a harsh resilience that caused most of her classmates to look away as she met eyes with them. Bedulah was guarded and introverted, but as she thought back on how the town folks treated her dearly departed mother, she wasn't about to let herself be scared off of doing what she needed to. At lunch, Bedulah sat alone in the cafeteria. She stood out like a sore thumb and drew side eyes and odd stares from the other students. Sitting 2 tables away with an especially disgusted look on her face was Desiree Proctor and her 2 friends, Candace and Skylar. "What's wrong with her?" Candace asked. "Yeah, why is she so ogurely?" Skylar continued. "Believe it or not, I used to go to elementary school with her, and she was weird back then too, but not this weird." Desiree chuckled in her response. "Then what happened to her?" Candace asked. "Well, my mama told me that Bedulah's mama was a witch. They called her the Backwoods witch because she lived deep in the woods away from the city," Desiree explained. "She died when Bedulah was only 9 years old. Everything surrounding her mother's death was really mysterious. Only a week after she died, her father moved to the city to live with the town hussy, Gretchen. Weirdly enough, Bedulah stayed in the backwoods. Maybe living out there by herself drove her crazy." Candace frowned at Bedulah before saying, "Yeah, she definitely looks crazy." A devious smile formed across Desiree's face before she said, "Hey, I got an idea," and whispered into her friend's ears, eliciting laughter from the 2. Ellsworth happened to be walking past, and a frown came upon his face as he heard what Desiree said. He looked at the lonesome Bedulah eating her lunch alone and shook his head in shame at what the 3 girls had planned for her. On the walk home, Bedulah noticed Desiree and her friends following her, talking loudly and laughing at one another's jokes. Unmistakably, Bedulah was the head of the joke as Desiree blurted out, "Wasn't her mom called the Backwoods witch or something like that?" Bedulah quickly turned and looked at the girls. Just then, everyone got quiet and all the laughing stopped. Bedulah glared furiously at Desiree, causing her to laugh even harder. Bedulah noticed Ellsworth off in the distance, behind the girls. He lagged behind the crowd with a perplexed look on his face as he quickly ran past the 3 girls to catch up to Bedulah. "Pay her no mind, Bedulah," he said. "She's just probably jealous because you're so, I'm so what?" Bedulah asked curiously. Never mind," he responded. "By the way, I'm Ellsworth Dooley. Would it be okay if I walk you home?" Bedulah looked shocked because no one ever shared her company on purpose. Nevertheless, Bedulah smiled with her hand covering her mouth, hiding her 2 chipped front teeth, and said, "Yes, I can't see no harm in it." The girls watched the interaction between Bedulah and Ellsworth with nasty smirks on their faces. "What does he think he's doing?" asked Skylar. "I don't know, but it doesn't matter," responded Desiree. Ellsworth walked Bedulah up the main road towards the deepest part of the woods. Bedulah began to feel anything but confidence about her living situation, sleeping in the barn and all. She quickly became embarrassed of Ellsworth finding out about it. She respectfully thanked him before telling him she had lots of chores to do and she'd catch up with him another day. Ellsworth looked disappointed but smiled and proceeded back towards the main road to his home. He shot a nasty glance at Desiree and her girlfriends as he passed them and angrily said, "Why don't y'all find something better to do with your miserable selves instead of messing with her? Y'all don't get tired of hating on prettier girls?" "Boy, whatever," Desiree dismissively responded to Ellsworth. "Yeah, bye," Candace added. Desiree and her girlfriends found themselves maneuvering through the trees, snapping pictures of Bedulah on their camera phones from afar as they followed her. They were so obvious that Bedulah turned back to see them more than once, but couldn't care less. Bedulah laughed at the fact that they were so obsessed with her that they'd rather spend their spare time discussing and stalking her. They continued to follow her all the way to her shack and snapped pictures of her entering the barn. Desiree's eyes opened wide, and she burst into laughter, saying, "No way! Don't tell me this girl lives in a barn! Oh my God, this house is just nasty. How does she live like this?" Candace shouted with disgust. "All I know is that our social media page is gonna explode when they see this," added Skylar. "The Backwoods witch is alive and she's my classmate." The three girls burst into laughter. Desiree looked around and a frown formed across her face. "This place is making me feel uncomfortable. Let's head back," said Desiree. As she turned to leave, her attention was captured by the old redwood tree stump with the words and images carved into it. "Oh, I gotta get a pic of this," she added, before snapping a picture with her phone. The girls headed back through the backwoods and toward the main road. The backwoods were thick with trees and bushes. A look of unease formed across Candace's face. "Is this the way we came?" Candace uttered. "Yeah, I don't remember it being this many trees," Skylar added. "Y'all chill, we're going the right way," Desiree reassured them. Suddenly, a thick red mist began to fill the air around the girls, causing all of them to freeze in fear. "Oh my God, Desiree, what is that?" yelled Candace. "I don't know, but we need to get the hell out of here," responded a frightened Desiree. The girls took off running. They were heaving and gasping for air while pushing one another out of the way when all of a sudden, Candace and Skylar began to slowly and grotesquely morph into hog-like creatures. "Oh my God, what's happening to me?" a terrified Candace yelled. "This can't be real," Skylar screamed. Desiree looked on in terror as her raving and delirious friends took off running wild through the woods and out of sight. Desiree, still running past the trees, could hear insidious laughter followed by a sinister voice echoing throughout the woods, saying, "This little piggy went to the market. This little piggy stayed home. This little piggy had roast beef. And this little piggy is done." Suddenly, the ghastly visages of Desiree's fiendish, hog-like friends appeared before her. Desiree was frozen still. Her eyes turned gray as she stopped and gasped before slowly, grotesquely morphing into a creature similar to her friends. Seemingly overtaken by some greater force, she retreated on all fours deep into the backwoods. Bedulah woke in the middle of the night and could see frost coming from her breath and icicles hanging off of the wooden barn doors. She could hear tiny voices laughing in the most creepy, ominous way, a laugh she'd never heard before. Suddenly, she noticed 3 shadows forming near the barn door, small, pitch-black shadows that seemed to be moving closer to where she was lying. In that moment, Bedulah's eyes opened once again as she was jolted awake. Bedulah sighed in relief as she realized that she was only dreaming. She threw the frazzled blanket aside and jumped from the pile of old clothes, seemingly with a new lease on life. Hardly feeling any back pain at all from her nightly uncomfortable sleeping situation, Bedulah's driving force for the day was to make herself look presentable in her classmates' eyes. Bedulah jumped up but was instantly caught by surprise to see a new lamp sitting where her mother's old lamp was. Bedulah walked over to the lamp and grabbed a sticky note attached to it that read, "From Pa and Gretchen, to keep you warm at night." As Bedulah stared at the lamp, a quiet fire began to burn inside of her. A look of malice glinted in her eyes, and she crumpled the sticky note in her hand. The anger inside her grew even more fierce, and the lamp's fire lit before it exploded. Staring at the destroyed lamp, a sudden calm came over Bedulah, and she smiled. She walked over to the old basin filled with icy water and disrobed, grabbed the old face towel and bar of soap that sat on the corner of the chair next to it, and began to lather herself down, scrubbing her face and body over and over again until she became squeaky clean and rinsed herself off with the remaining water in the basin. After drying off, Bedulah threw on an old oversized dress and grabbed the bar of soap and ran down to the creek barefoot, leaned forward over the water, and began to wet her and lather her thick brown hair several times, scrubbing and scrubbing until it too was so clean it shined. Bedulah quickly dried herself and put on her garments and a long black dress that her mother used to wear years ago. Bedulah was a little older now, so it fit her perfectly. She grabbed a brush and comb that lay on an old spirit board underneath an old rickety chair. She parted her hair down the middle and smoothed it out of her face. She grabbed a bottle of oil from behind the table and rubbed it all over her legs, arms, feet, and hair. Bedulah looked into an old chipped mirror that she kept near the table and was stunned by what she saw reflected, her mother's face looking back at her. Bedulah grabbed her backpack, flung open the barn door, and headed off to school. As Bedulah approached the school, she noticed police cars parked everywhere. There were several staff and students talking with police officers. Ellsworth quickly approached Bedulah, and an astonished look formed across his face as he said, "Wow, Bedulah, you look beautiful." "I know," Bedulah quickly responded with a laugh, before asking about the police presence. Ellsworth explained to Bedulah that Desiree, Candace, and Skylar apparently never returned home the night before and were all reported missing by their parents. Bedulah's eyes opened wide with surprise. "Oh, my stars," Bedulah said under her breath as she walked over to a bench to sit down. "I know they intended on playing some kind of joke on you," Ellsworth confessed. "Did you see anything happen to them?" Bedulah told Ellsworth that she was aware of their shenanigans, but it didn't bother her as she was used to ridicule. However, she sincerely professed that she didn't see where they went after she entered her house. Suddenly, 2 police officers approached and began to question Bedulah. They asked Bedulah her whereabouts at the time of the girl's disappearance. After questioning Bedulah for about 20 minutes, the officers soon realized that she was just another student who could have easily gone missing like Desiree and her friends. The school held an assembly and explained to the students that the school would be closed until further notice. Ellsworth offered to walk Bedulah home once again, but she declined, stating that she needed to take care of some business in the city, but he could come visit later that night if he wanted. He happily agreed, and they went their separate ways. Later that evening, at Gretchen's house, she and Reverend McCarthy sat at the end of the bed, watching the news. They both watched with fearful eyes at the reports of the girls that went missing in the woods near Bedulah's shack. Slowly, their eyes met one another's, their expressions full of dread. "You don't think it could have been—" Gretchen fearfully uttered before being cut off by Reverend McCarthy, who quickly responded, "No!" Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Reverend McCarthy motioned his head for Gretchen to go answer it. She left the room and headed to the door. The Reverend listened as Gretchen answered the door and in a dreadful tone said, "Gloria, is that you?" "Gloria!" Reverend McCarthy shouted before jumping out of his bed and running to the living room. Upon entering the living room, he saw Gretchen lying on the floor, coughing up blood, her eyes bloodshot red, and her skin turning pale. "Oh my God," he yelled, running over to Gretchen. "Looks familiar, don't it?" said a voice from behind Reverend McCarthy. He turned around to see Bedulah sitting in a chair. "Bedulah," he frightenedly uttered. "I said, don't it look familiar?" Bedulah yelled at her father. "My mama blessed that lamp before she died. It was to hold her spirit so she could watch over me after she passed. When I broke that lamp, it set her spirit free, and she told me what happened. She told me how y'all poisoned her because y'all was scared of what she would do if she found out you was cheating with Gretchen behind her back. Everyone was always scared of her, but she wasn't a witch. She was only a healer. All she ever wanted to do was help people." Bedulah stood to her feet and began walking toward her father. "Bedulah, please," her father begged as she inched closer. "Yeah, she was a healer, but not me," Bedulah confessed. "She knew it when I was born with a veil over my eyes. That's why y'all stayed in the backwoods. It wasn't to protect me. It was to protect everybody else from me. I am the backwoods witch. And now that I know that, it's gonna be hell to pay for anybody that does me wrong, even my own blood. Bye, Pa." Bedulah stretched out her hand and rendered her father paralyzed as she escaped through the back door. A good distance away, Bedulah looked back as the house exploded and a smile developed across her face from the light of the flames. It was night, and Bedulah was headed down the road towards home when she stumbled upon Ellsworth leaned against a tree, waiting for her. "You've been waiting all this time for me?" an impressed Bedulah asked. "Shoot, I ain't have nothing else to do," a bashful Ellsworth responded. They walked, conversed, and laughed the whole way to Bedulah's shack. Their joyful conversation was halted as Ellsworth was taken aback by the dreadful appearance of Bedulah's home. Bedulah smirked at Ellsworth before saying, "What, something wrong?" "Nah, this just looks a little different from what I expected, I guess," Ellsworth responded. Bedulah laughed before telling Ellsworth to wait outside while she retrieved something from inside the house. Ellsworth looked at her with understanding eyes as she entered the house. He sat down on the old redwood stump. He frowned as he struggled to find comfort. He stood before having his attention captured by the stump itself. On the stump, now added to the list of names, were Desiree, Candace, and Skylar. Beside each was a new drawing of a wild human-like creature. "What the hell?" Ellsworth whispered to himself. "Oh, you see my new friends," said Bedulah, who exited the house holding firewood and a book of matches. "See, I never had many friends, so I started making some of my own when I was a little girl." Bedulah dropped the firewood on the ground and opened the book of matches. "Wait, these are the names of the girls from our class, right?" Ellsworth questioned. "Their names? No, that's them," responded a laughing Bedulah. Ellsworth reeled back in horror as 3 wild hog-like creatures appeared from behind the trees in the woods. "Oh my God!" Ellsworth yelled. "I think Desiree, Candace, and Skylar look a lot better like this. Don't you agree?" A terrified Ellsworth was paralyzed with fear, shaking uncontrollably. You'd be shocked at what a conjurer could do with her imagination, playfully said Bedulah as she struck a match and dropped it on the wood, igniting a campfire that glowed off of her face. Slowly, from behind each tree, more small wild creatures appeared and convened around the fire, dancing and howling loudly. New life, new skin, new breath, new blood, summoned by the gifted one. Bedulah sat down on her redwood tree stump like it was her throne. Grinning widely, a knife appeared in her right hand. She peered at Ellsworth and in a sinister tone said, "So, Ellsworth, still want to be my friend?"